This is my final closing statements in my debate with Armoured Apologist on is it reasonable to conclude that a supernatural creator exists. My opening argumentation and everything that followed on my side was never shown to be logically incoherent by my opponent. This was largely left alone. Thus, those conclusions, if evaluated by other people to be logically coherent, means that we can't be skeptical of my conclusion. We don't have any reason to be. My opponent's argumentations, when he did give them, were full of logical errors. From special pleading to special knowledge to straw man to weak analogies, quotes from various different sources. None of these things matter. The argument has to stand or fail on its own, independent of anything that anyone else has ever said, period. If we were doing an essay, then it would be appropriate to use these sort of citations, but we're not. We're doing an argument within the dialect of informal logic, within the dialogue of persuasionary dialogue. Theoretically, or hypothetically, I suppose you could say, speaking, we're supposed to be able to convince each other, one of us is, of the position that we have. In reality, that rarely happens. And so these sort of debates are really aimed at the audience, the fence sitters, whoever might be out there. It is for them that I am so rigid with my logic and the formal fallacies and so on and so forth. I laughed at the thumbnail that he used, that God hates logic, formal fallacies. I thought that was hilarious, and I appreciate him poking a little bit of fun at my insistence that he try to avoid making a formal fallacy. That he couldn't quite agree with me that it was a formal fallacy, but he did avoid using it, and I'm very grateful for him not doing that. This is why I want to teach informal logic. I want people to understand it, and maybe I'm not that good of a teacher, and so they should read some books on it, and that's fine. None of this, by the way, matters for the debate, but I wanted to frame all of this in the context so that my opponent and you hopefully understand better where I'm coming from. I don't know whether there is a thing that we would call God. I don't know. I don't know what supernatural is, or even if it is a thing. It needs to be demonstrated in some way, shape, or form, and it hasn't been, at least to the best of my knowledge. The arguments that my opponent presents, even if they were logically valid, wouldn't prove God. They couldn't prove God. They couldn't prove a supernatural force. At best, you would have an intelligent designer that could be another human in a different sort of universe that made this universe. And you would never know. You could never tell the difference because we're inside the universe. We're not outside the universe, if there is such a thing as outside the universe. There's a lot of mistakes that my opponent makes, especially in regards to a true infinite and a potential infinite. If no true infinite is allowed, then the deity that you're talking about cannot exist forever. It cannot be eternal. And you can't get out of that by saying, well, God's not inside of time. Because if you allow something that isn't inside of time to be infinite, then everything could be infinite that isn't within time, which means whatever made, quote-unquote, the universe could be infinite in nature and not God. It could be a materialistic thing that just existed for all time, because there is no time, and because it's timeless, it doesn't have time, it doesn't need time, and it simply caused the universe to exist because it did, and that's just what it did, and there's no rhyme or reason to it. I don't know what the answer is. Inductive reasoning can get us so far. Whether we are in philosophy or in informal logic, there is a limit to that. We discovered this, for lack of a better word, during the Enlightenment by and large, when people said, you know what, logic's fine, but let's just look at stuff and figure out what this stuff does. and let's start making experiments to test what this stuff does, and write down these ideas and see if the same thing happens when someone else does it. My opponent gets right that our experiences are by and large how we live our normal lives. He gets that completely right, and we turn that into a methodology that we now call science. We try to, and we're still trying to, iron out all of the problems that humans bring to the table when they try to find out what's going on in this world that we exist in. We try to get rid of personal bias. We try to get rid of assumptions. We have other people test the same thing. We have other people look at the same ideas, and we do that so that we can eliminate confirmation bias and other biases as best as we possibly can. And we, at the end of the day, we get this wonderful system that we call science that has produced so many things that it's unfathomable how many things it's produced. Computers, the internet, clean water, healthcare, benefits, blah, 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 blah. The list goes on and on and on. Religion/theology produces one thing, and that thing that it produces is, this is how to explain our particular traditions, ideas, creation myths, etc. That's it. That's all it can do. It can't do more than that. Philosophy produces no result in the sense that I can say a cat in a blender, and that's some sort of philosophical concept now, but that doesn't have any rhyme or reason in the real world. And although philosophy is fun, and many of the things we use have philosophical ideas in them, I'm not saying that philosophy is useless, although that could be one way to look at it. I'm just saying that there is no structure within philosophy in general to get to a conclusion that the other person also is going to get to. Now, when we took ideas from philosophy and we made what's called logic, or in this case, informal logic is now the correct wording to use when we're describing the type of logic that I'm engaging in this debate and other places, we made a system that if both people utilize it correctly, you'll get to the same result every time. The problem in this debate is that my opponent had logical fallacies and never corrected them, and instead made additional logical fallacies, appeals to analogy, false analogies. A twister can make a car. That's not how the universe works. If that's really how he thinks the universe works, I would suggest he write up a scientific paper on that. That would be very interesting. There's only so much we know, for sure, and then we run into question marks. We can't use deductive reasoning to figure out what the answer is in the case of the universe, or in many other cases. Deductive reasoning, logic, what we call informal logic, has a limit. It can only tell us what to be skeptical of or what not to be skeptical of. It can't tell us what's really true. Science gets closer to that. We're never probably going to get to the point where we can say this is true, period. We're always going to probably have this, well, it's as close as we're going to get to whatever the truth is. The skeptic is okay with that. The theist can't be, because theology says this is the answer. Continue to say that this is the answer, because if you don't, then you don't have this theology anymore. Theology has its mind made up, ready for it. Science, skepticism, does not. And it is for that reason that I maintain my skepticism, because we don't have any empirical evidence. We don't have any repeatable tests. And finally, and most important for this debate, we don't have a logically coherent argument on my opponent's side. And unless and until we have that logically coherent argument, we must continue to be skeptical of his conclusions.